3 years ago, in Bratislava, at the Globsec conference, we noticed Mikheil Saakashvili and Mustafa Nayyem among guests. At that time, Saakashvili was the rising star of the Ukrainian politics, and Nayyem was well known as one of the organizers of the Maidan events. It was 1 year after the revolution. They were speaking together in harmony, and now after 3 years, the situation is completely different. We are not in Bratislava. We are in Kiev now, at the Independence Square, and Mustafa is sitting next to me, but Saakashvili is not. Mustafa, I have to ask you, what happened, Mikheil Saakashvili? If we talk about Saakashvili, is that there is the quintessence of Ukrainian politics, meaning that all possible violations that could happen against a politician after Maidan happened towards Saakashvili. I think that Mikheil was illegally deprived of the citizenship and, of course, he was deported from Ukraine illegally. According to international legislation, it's nonsense. This simply can't happen. This is regarding why he is not here now. But if we take a look at what he was doing in Ukraine and what happened, this is also like a mirror of this time, because Mikheil Saakashvili is really a great politician, a person who did many things. While being in Ukraine, I think he probably slightly underestimated or even overestimated the situation here. What Saakashvili was saying in the last 3 years, this was what people in Ukraine have been talking for a long time before that, about corruption and the need to fight it. There are not so many possibilities to unite all the elites in the country at the same time. And this was the biggest problem of Saakashvili, not being able to unite them. He did not find the right words and methods to unite the people around him and fight for something. And one of the reasons was that he started working in Poroshenko's government, meaning he was his partner. For a long time, he didn't criticize him. For a long time, for many reasons, he tried to stay away from the criticism, and many people could not understand it. Another thing is that his connections with the local elites were not as strong in order to create a team to move forward with. His personal character traits did not let him find these new friends or new partners. I think it's all about politics in Ukraine. Illegal action of the government and impossibility of people who don't like it to unite in a team that would be able to solve those problems in a constructive way. For Slovakia and the Czech Republic, it may be hard to understand that one can get the citizenship of another country, like Saakashvili from Georgia did in Ukraine, in order to help with reforms, and then the same person got deprived of it, although illegally. In our countries, one would have to do a terrible thing to be punished like that. So what was the worst thing he did? Why did Ukraine take it away from him? I cannot say that he did something so bad that the Ukrainian people and Ukraine as a country would need to deprive him of his citizenship. I think the worst thing he did was not in respect of Ukraine or the Ukrainian people. It was in respect of those elites who hoped to use him and whom he even let use him for some time. And then he started the war against them. I mean, first of all, the presidential team. Saakashvili was criticizing him harshly. Sometimes it was even too much. But this was something surprising for the president, who tried to use Saakashvili as a member of his team, who will lead him to the parliamentary elections. He received such proposals. So I think the main thing he did was criticizing the president. He talked openly about the things that were taking place, about corruption, about using power for personal enrichment, about actions in the opposition. Saakashvili was saying nothing new. I mean, everybody was saying that. There are many investigations there, but Saakashvili was doing that openly. He was also doing that in a different political way. Very briefly, in a free country, it is impossible, just for criticizing the president. That is what we are saying. From the point of view of democracy, freedom of rights, and free political space, there is no difference between what was done with Saakashvili and what Yanukovych did with the opposition in his cadence. Maybe the methods have changed. Maybe it was changed in terms that it was done in a soft way, in a hidden way, or not. But the instincts remained the same. The instincts of the elite remained the same. And this is what we put on the line before elections. We say that those elites are not much different. Maybe they are different in the way they communicate. In many things, they had to change. They are not so pro-Russian in many things. But if you ask them about instincts, enrichment, law, violation, and use of power against the opponents, their instincts remained the same. Now, let's go back to Maidan. If I turn around, it now looks like a typical square somewhere in Europe in summer. But not so long ago, that large building was covered with a huge poster saying, "Freedom is our religion," as it burnt down after fire. Nowadays, it looks almost completely renovated. The square is pleasant. 4 years ago, there was a fire and people were dying here. Mustafa was right in the middle of these things. If I compare what it was like before and what it is now, there is a huge difference. In those 4 years, has Ukraine also changed a lot? Many things in Ukraine have changed irreversibly. And here we need to tell a bit about the history of our country for our viewers. Not many people in Europe know that when we wake up every day in our country, we break the records of our independence. It is not just words. It is really the longest period in our history when we are independent. We have never been independent for so long, ever. And what happened on Maidan, it was not just a protest or an attempt to change the regime. And now we understand. If we take a look at what happened for years, the war, Crimea, Donbass, and what the Russian Federation is doing now, Maidan was a part of this war for independence, which started much earlier than Maidan. What makes Ukraine different from that one we had 4 years ago? First of all, I think it is not just independence from Russia, it is also independence from our Soviet history, when people were afraid of the state. If you take a look at the young generation, for example, in Belarus and, for example, in Russia, they have already been infected with the fear of the state. If you take a look around here and somebody will see a policeman, we are not afraid of him, even if a policeman has all the ammunition on him. If he behaves in the wrong way, people will be able to say no. In Belarus or Russia, the feelings are very different, because they are still dependent on this tradition to be afraid of the state. We are not afraid of that. And this is the main thing that happened. We are not afraid, and we can say no. The second thing is that we finally started perceiving the state not as a territory, but as the borders, currency, flag, anthem, history, and our struggle altogether. I don't mean only struggle of a country, but also of the society against the state, or those who try to humiliate that society through corruption, through lack of respect, through lack of transparency and accountability. It's all the fight for independence. In that sense, the country has become much more grown up. Now we have the real tools to fight. What didn't happen was that we were not able to complete the agenda that was established during Maidan. In this sense, for me and my generation, Maidan is not over. We created such a tool as the Anti-Corruption Bureau, which people from the past and present government are trying to destroy. We created the new patrol police that people are now trying to defame or to make it a part of the older structure of the previous or current government. We created many civil tools to control the state bodies. For example, we finally have the Council of the Public Control over the central authorities, and these councils can really make the difference in some places. They really select the people and participate in the contests, and they can speak about violations out loud. But I call all of that the erosion of the system so far. The system has been built for over 25 years. There is a lot of money behind it. And in this sense, unfortunately, Ukraine is a very rich country. You can earn huge money, and then you can hire the lawyers, politicians, and judges who will protect that. We have now created the tools that start to ruin this system. I hope that at the next stage we will be able to create structural things based on our experience that will be able to get the power and have a different country. I hope that at the next iteration there will be more of us and there will be a more structural approach. During every big change of a regime, if it is a change from an autocratic regime towards one based on liberty, there is a lot of idealism, and this mostly applies to young people. This was an extreme situation, as young people were even dying for their ideals 4 years ago, and some continue to die nowadays as well near Russian borders. Then the everyday, realistic life comes, and some dreams do not come true. In those 4 years, has Ukraine achieved something you are really proud of? You know, I don't want to sound pretentious now and to use big words. I'll just describe it in pictures. In 2014, after Maidan was over and the war started, I went to the front line as a journalist. I remember I visited the checkpoints at which were standing lawyers, photographers, just simple people wearing sports shoes and uniform. They got somewhere. It was so pathetic. It was just sad to look at. But those people were strong. They tried to be organized. Those were amateur attempts. But those volunteers held back the first wave. I remember that in those days, when the Ukrainian tank was passing by our checkpoint, many of those guys had tears in their eyes because we never even imagined we have tanks in our country and that they can even move. Same about the planes. Same about when the guys started getting their normal uniform. Then, when we saw our artillery, and it's not pathos. This is the reality. 4 years ago, I know it for sure, we didn't have the army. Now we have the army. We can be proud of it. Many people are skeptical about that. Many people are trying not to talk about that because this is the war. But I think that those guys who are now at the front line, our army, give an opportunity to Merkel and Macron or other world leaders to talk harshly with Putin. If it hadn't been for them, if they hadn't been here, they would have gotten to Kiev and no one would have talked like that. It's kind of surrealism. We are sitting here now, but the Deputy Chancellor of Austria wants to lift the sanctions off Russia, which continues killing our guys and seizing Crimea. We are sitting here now, and talking, while Germany and France tried to talk to Putin and let them build the Nord Stream. And this makes you think, what if Ukraine would not be here? They would come to an agreement. I have no doubts about it. So I'm proud we have those guys. The second thing I'm proud of is our generation, which tries to influence the current situation despite having no experience, no patterns of how to build politics and political structure. For your viewers, it's important to understand that you have seen for decades how journalists were turning into politicians, or businessmen were becoming politicians, or the scientists were turning into politicians. Your people saw how political parties were formed. They have parties to join. They have an understanding of how to unite and do something, not just in the streets throwing Molotov cocktails, but also in a routine daily life. We do not have that experience. Everything we know about democracy, freedom of speech, elections, and parties, we know either from books or from speeches of the Western politicians or from the movies. Nevertheless, this generation didn't give up. We didn't surrender to the old elites. We don't have the young elite that is funded by the oligarchs, and we have enough people in the regions and in the cities who can unite and start building a new country. It's now still like hanging in the air, but I think in a year it will turn into real votes. And has there been anything in those past 4 years you regret? Yes, I think if we start from the day of the beginning of Maidan, I think that not a single person would say it was worth the people's lives. You cannot ever overcome this. You can never get used to that. I am often asked, would you go to Maidan if you knew this was going to happen? I can never say yes. Even though I understand that we didn't know it at the time, maybe from the historical point of view, it was right. But people we lost are, I think, an emotional thing that will stay in our memories for many years. What I regret and what I regret now from the point of politics, I think my biggest regret is that after Maidan, we were not able to find some courage inside, or not even courage, but a bit of craziness to break away from everything and start creating our own teams. We didn't believe it was possible at the time. Maybe it was really not possible. It was unreal. We didn't have money. We didn't have any experience. The campaign lasted for 2 months, but I regret we didn't do that. And I regret nobody else did that. But it was a good experience. There are many things that I regret as an MP about some voting or the state bodies that we didn't pay attention to. But I think these are the historical days to be here, because today the question is being solved about the last element of the anti-corruption system, which is the anti-corruption court. If we don't vote for it in this convocation, and we don't create it, I will regret it a lot, really, because it is a huge piece of the wall of the new country that we can build now. I hope we can make it. Ukraine had very difficult tasks in the past 4 years, including being in the war with Russia. In 2018, what is the main task for Ukraine? Do you mean towards the Russian Federation or in general? Let me tell you what I dream about and what country I dream about. What will happen when we come to power. I dream about a country where the elites and country leaders would not care what anyone say, either from the West or from the East. I want, and my main goal is, for us and for the country to start listening to our own civil activists and our citizens, our own civil society, experts, teachers, and to use it as a basis when we transform the country and reform it. Because now many things happen under the pressure of the international community, which is a humiliating thing for the country, in my opinion. That's why my main task, and what I want us to do, is to create a big team of people all over the country which will be able to take the responsibility, starting from the local level, ending with the national level. And we don't need many things for this. People have to believe that it's possible. I know there are many people in the country, young people. I travel all over the country. I know there are dozens of thousands of young people, 35 to 40 years old, who want to do something. But for so many years, we were told it wouldn't work. For so many years, we were told the oligarchs, or people who rule the offices, are more important. They will crush you. For so many years, we were told there are gods on Olympus there, but you, the civil society, or small politicians, are somewhere over there at the low level. That we started believing at this. Somebody or something or some team should come and say, let's try, let's do it, let's take it. This is our country. So creating this team, creating this feeling that we can do it as the main goal. As for more concrete things, for many years I worked as a journalist. After that, it happened so that in the parliament I spent most of the time working on the law enforcement agencies, and I see in this country, and in my life, and in the life of all the politicians, one word which we use so much, but which is the wall for many common people sitting here. It's justice. Justice not in the sense that they should have the money or to live better. It's also true. The worst thing is when people are humiliated morally. When somebody is beaten up, somebody had something stolen, somebody was killed, somebody witnessed some crime, and they go to law enforcement agencies, to the court, to the prosecutor's office, and then they see they cannot change anything. This is the worst blow to the mental and moral state, to the image of the country, to the health of this person, to the attitude to the country and the place they live in. At that point, when everybody sitting here says, whatever happens, I can go to the police or the prosecutor's office, and they will help me, at least help me to achieve justice together. At that time, I will realize that we have really changed the country from the point of view of law enforcement agencies, and I want to do this. The last question, a very short one. We, as the Slovaks and Czechs, and people of the EU and NATO, can we help you somehow? I think that all our international partners can help us with two things. First, by having an understanding of the threat coming from our enemy, not just as a threat to us, but as a threat to them as well. Not to think of Ukraine as a border of Europe, but to consider it as a part of Europe. Not to live in the illusions that what happened to us cannot happen to you. When this realization comes, I'm sure you will do everything in the right way. Right now, there is a feeling that many people, like we're sitting here, and we think that the front line is so far, but it's only 7 hours away. In the same way, the Europeans think that the war is somewhere very far. Then Brexit happens. The ultra-right radicals happen in Germany or France. Then we have attacks on the infrastructure in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, etc. This feeling that we are together, it's not just words. That is what can really help us. Ukraine needs this feeling now. The second thing we need, the European Union. The European countries spend a lot of funds to finance our reforms. I have only one request. For each euro you spend in our country, spend 10 cents to control where this euro goes. We will live much better, trust me. And you will know much better on what you spend your money.
Mustafa, thank you.
When we talk about Russia, it always depends on the perspective of our country. We saw that in our previous discussion, in which participated guests from Ukraine and Belarus, and in this section we have people from Hungary and Poland. When I speak for myself, from the perspective of my generation, I see Russia as a country that forcefully brought communism to our country, and we contributed to it as well. And when we wanted to make a reform of the communist regime, the Soviet Union responded by sending tanks and invading us. How do the Polish and Hungarian people see Russia?
Should I start? Or? Tehát én kezdem.
So, I'll take the floor. I'd like to begin with the title of the debate. It's a very good title. It's very important, and I'll serve it as much as I can. But the first thing that came to my mind was that the solution is somewhere else. It's not Russia that we should be dealing with. The processes taking place in Russia, which have an effect on other countries, it's all a part of a global network. So, I prefer to look at all of it together. Things happening in Russia, Brexit, Trump's election, Erdogan, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the Polish political machinery, everything is interrelated. I like to perceive things in terms of correlations and processes, and it's easier to think about solutions when you look at all these correlations. Can I take the discussion in this direction? So let's listen to Wojciech's opinion on this. Well, I agreed to take a discussion in such a broader direction. I'm a Pole, but I work professionally with the topic of Caucasus, and today we are in a Georgian restaurant in Kiev, so we could bring into our discussion some neighboring countries, not only Central Eastern Europe. We can talk about the Southern Caucasus as well. Moreover, Georgia has European aspiration. Very interesting processes are taking place there. The change of government has taken place recently. It is in the shadow of Russia. The change of government has taken place recently. It is in the shadow of Russia. Russia plays a very important role there. However, as a Pole, I will also say that for us, Russia is a kind of a dormant volcano, which is somewhere nearby and can explode at any moment. That's why a life next to Russia is like a life next to an unpredictable volcano. Let's get back to your definition, the way of thinking that we can see in Russia, the idea that everything around Russia is a closed borderland with only a limited sovereignty, basically a sphere of Russian influence. This is not something that came with Trump or Putin or Brexit. This is something that has been present in history for a long time. That's why I'm asking, is this changing? We can then go back to the contemporary situation. But my question is whether you can feel that today's Russia continues with the imperialistic tradition. Yes, I also think that Russia is continuing its imperialistic concept. But they are not leaders in this. They can't be held responsible. There's always an interaction between the demand of the masses and the inclinations of the leaders. Hitler couldn't have done what he did in his country if he hadn't been authorized by the population. So the choice here is either the principle of the legal state or the concentration of power. If we consider these the two poles, neither of them exists in this pure condition, where one would mean perfectly concentrated power, like George Orwell said in 1984, and the other a completely transparent, incorrupt legal state, a complete sharing of power, which is the ideal of the West and the Scandinavian countries. So, if we consider the world in terms of these two poles, then after the Middle Ages, we can draw concentric circles from South England and the Netherlands towards east and south in every direction, going more and more outward, and those phase countries will be lagging behind. They are following the center, only with a phase difference, a delay. The more outward we move from the center, the more we head east, the greater the lag will be. So Russia and the Arab world is right where England used to be in the 18th century. Perhaps in terms of concentration of power. Now, as regards the concentration of power, the more they are inclined towards an imperialistic regime, the more danger they pose to the countries around them, and at the current level of technology, to the whole world. I agree with the statement that Russia can be compared with other global powers, compared with other global players. Russia as a former or, to some extent, a present colonial empire, as something which is called, and can be described as, a colonial instinct, a desire to manage the lands. This sphere of influence, let's say, simply was in line with the Russian interests. It is at least the 19th century tradition, if not older. If we take a look at the way Russia dealt with the Caucasus, with Central Asia, but also with the occupied Polish territories, we will see that Russia was, and I want to tell you that it remains so far, extremely flexible. What we often forget is a manifestation of colonial instinct. Russia treated the occupied territories in various ways. Let's finish on the 19th century. I will not go further into the past. Some of the lands were directly incorporated into Russia. Some of the lands remained under the management of the existing dynasties. For example, the biggest part of Georgia was totally incorporated between 1801 and 1810. But, for example, the biggest part of Georgia was totally incorporated between 1801 and 1810. But, for example, Abkhazia, until the mid-19th century, had its own princely dynasty, Princes Zasabar Zvervazazi, and only after anti-Russian uprising, Russia got rid of those local structures and established Suchmask military district. On the other hand, when it comes to Central Asia, the Emirate of Bukhara formally remained independent under the revolution, until the Bolshevik coup. Although, of course, Russia had a profound impact on what was happening there, on the policy of Bukhara. After the Bolsheviks came to power, Stalin was responsible for the national policy. He came from the Caucasus, where there were many nations, many cultures and languages, and he had a perfect understanding of it. We could say he was in the Soviet Union as a Caucasian clan warlord. It was quite noticeable in the Caucasus, where he knew well and was evidenced by the administrative division. For example, in the North Caucasus. In one unit, there were such nations as, for example, Caucasian and Karakayans, one Caucasian nation, another of Turkish origin. There were other nations as well, but in order to make them equal and to keep the situation under control, they were usually separated from one another. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia also executed such policy in the North Caucasus, which is part of Russia. Russia, of course, helped Abkhazians in the war in the early 1990s, as a result of which Tbilisi lost control over Abkhazia. However, then when it seemed that the Shevardnadze, a Georgian leader, would respect Russian interests, for many years, Abkhazia was under blockade, and relations with Georgia were very good. Similarly, when the Rose Revolution took place, Russia initially had a lot of confidence to Saakashvili. Anyway, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ivanov, negotiated the shift of power from Shevardnadze to Saakashvili, and only then, when it turned out that Saakashvili is very consistent in Euro-Atlantic aspirations, membership in NATO and in the European Union, only then Russia changed its policy, stopped the blockade of Abkhazia, and after the Russian-Georgia War of 2008, recognized the independence of Abkhazia. In contrast, relations with Georgia were the same we have now. Diplomatic relations are broken at the moment. I'd like to draw our attention to this imperial instinct and this flexibility, because on the one hand, the independence of Abkhazia has been recognized by Russia de facto from Moscow's point of view. Of course, this is a view not shared by a vast part of the world. Abkhazia is an independent state, while Crimea was annexed and became a part of the Russian Federation. So Russia still uses 19th century approach and cares both about own territories and also about the areas neighboring with it. In such a way, Russia shows its imperial instinct and flexibility, and we often neglect it. We are sitting at Kiev's Independence Square, or Maidan Square, and this is the place where you would see the Ukrainian dream, the dream of freedom that many people had, a dream of a country that belongs to the free world. We've agreed that from the historical point of view, Russia has had a continuous imperialistic approach towards Ukraine. Russia does not respect independence of countries around it. What are the hopes for countries like Ukraine or Belarus to live freely? It depends on two factors. It depends on the weakness of Russia, because Russia, if it is strong, especially when it comes to Ukraine, will try to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence. It is a traditional approach. For example, Solzhenitsyn in the 70s proposed to give independence to the Caucasus, Central Asia, while Ukraine, Belarus and northern Kazakhstan had to stay with Russia. This is what Solzhenitsyn proposed, and without Ukraine, this dream about restoration of the Russian power will not come true. That is why the role of Ukraine is so important. So the independence of Ukraine, Georgia, the Caucasus countries, Moldova, depends on two factors. On the weakness of Russia, because if Russia is weak, it will not be able to influence these areas. And the second factor is the determination of the West. Determination of the West evidenced by support of independence and very strong signals proving the independence of Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova is something inviolable, and we are ready to defend. But it's a matter of time when Russia will decide to check we are really ready for it or not. At the beginning, you wanted to change the topic, saying that Putin is not here by himself, but as a part of a wider context or wider movements. What do you mean? In what way is he a result of a wider movement? Well, I'm interested in the possible outcomes, what the world would turn into. Let me react to the question you asked Wojciech before, about the prospects for Ukraine living next to Russia and Ukraine's future. When I think about this, I take my own country as a basis, and I'd prefer if Hungary didn't become independent. So, I'd like a federation. I want a union where borders are symbolic, where there's a kind of federation like in the United States of America. Precisely because they don't have a past, local cultural ties are very strong, very active, and they pay attention to every little detail, every cultural nuance of the past. And I think the national past, cultural cohesion, natural cultures can be stronger if they're not disturbed by the political nation. An independent nation is suicide politically. Culturally, it's okay. Culturally, it's a root and it's useful. National identity, the concept of nation. Politically, I think it's been proven that it's a suicide and it's crazy to have nation as a political formation. I know it's a utopia, but this is the direction I take my country. As for Ukraine, this is their option as well. Same goes for Russia. Ukraine is closer to Europe, so obviously Western influences are stronger than in Russia. They're a little closer to Russia, and they feel more threatened by Russia. So I'd reflect on the title of this debate, which includes Russia. I don't feel comfortable with it. It's like demonizing Russia, which is legitimate. Russia does seem demonic, as all empires are demonic. But I'd like to look at it more systematically, more abstractly, the states where power is concentrated, and treat Russia as one of these concentrations of power. Such formations are opposed to federations, unions, the dismissal of borders, the groups of people ruling these states. Their interest is conflict. Because it is by conflicts that they can maintain their power. So they always need to find an enemy, focus on some kind of hatred. At this point, the whole issue turns into a question of individual mental education to me. So the way out of this situation is the education of individuals, which is a terribly long process. The western half of Europe took 1,000 years to get where it is now, and is not over yet. Let's hope it's not over yet. Why do you avoid saying that Russia is a threat for its neighbours? Is it demonization? Isn't it just a description of facts? No. I also think it's a threat for neighbouring states, for the independent states. Hungary is not a neighbour of Russia, but even for Hungary, it's a threat insofar as the current Hungarian leadership prefers to position itself as a vassal of Russia. This is an actual process. So I feel not only that the neighbours of Russia are under threat, but also that my country is threatened, even if this threat is not so immediate. I'm not trying to whitewash Russia. I wouldn't focus on Russia, because Russia is but a moment in global tendencies. Similar things are happening in other countries as well. In Turkey, for instance, Turkey reverted from shared power back to the consolidation of power. And the same has happened in Poland and Hungary. So, we can find a solution to Russia and its neighbourhood once we can see the global processes. That's why I prefer to look at them. In this sense, it is quite interesting to talk about proud Hungary. In 1989, when Viktor Orbán was a liberal, we welcomed him on the stage. We gave him applause, and we thanked him. But now, Hungary is turning into an authoritarian regime, more similar to Russia. What has happened in Hungary? Why has Russia become more of a role model for Hungary than the West? In 1989 to 1990, the change of regime took place. The old socialist regime collapsed, and Hungary got an opportunity to share the power, to approach the West and become European, to approach the model of transparency and sharing of power. But it was difficult. In a way, we succeeded. It was a big leap from socialism, with a lot of corruption, dirty deals. But we were progressing. There was independent public media. There were independent legal state institutions. For instance, sometimes the President of the Republic didn't pass bills submitted for signing and rejected them. And so on, we had an independent prosecution service. So our chances were good, but it wasn't perfect. The living standards of the masses didn't improve. And that's it. The masses lost their patience. They said, "Oh, it's not working." Then, "Thank you for inviting us, but we'd prefer to stay in the Middle Ages." This is a simplified version, but more or less this is what really happened. Orbán understood this. He has very good antennae for this. And he welcomed this demand of the masses, namely that we don't want responsibility. I don't want to be free, because that comes with responsibility, and I have to be responsible for my own life in order to govern my own destiny. But I don't want this. I want a leader who promises to provide the goods, the jobs, the enemies I can blame for my faults, saying that it is not my responsibility because the enemy is responsible. The multinational companies, the Jews, the Gypsies, or Brussels, the EU, George Soros, so they are actually playing with these cards in alternating succession, or the migrants right now. So this is what works. It's such a mass demand in Hungary, and probably in other countries too, which is very deeply rooted. Socialism was based on the same principle as well as the pre-World War II regimes. And before that, the monarchy in the 19th century. Within families, this is a tradition that is passed on generation after generation, and there is great responsibility in whether a leadership reinforces this or works in a more enlightened way. And Orbán decided to select and gather around himself a group of politicians who are suitable for serving him, and decided that he'd go back to the Middle Ages. This is a livable form of life. The medieval system works. This concentration of power, where everyone is a child, where everyone has one boss who protects them, who provides them with the goods. So no one governs their own life, and no one wants to govern their own life. This worked in the Middle Ages. This worked in ancient Egypt. And it would work today. The only problem is that this is designed for permanence and stillness. If the environment is mobile, it will collapse. And the current environment is all about mobility. Just briefly, does this mean that in this sense and in this model, Hungary is becoming more similar to Russia than to the West? Yes, this is what has happened in the past 8 years. Hungary has slightly shifted towards Asia in the past 8 years. And Poland? It is interesting that Poland is also a very proud country, and historically it had very bad experience with Russia. This was paid for by millions of lives, but if we look at contemporary Poland, it could almost seem that something similar could be said like we said about Hungary. There is this concentration of power. There might be some kind of movement towards a model resembling Russia, don't you think so? Of course, Poland is very cautious when it comes to Russia, but the country's structure becomes similar to Russia these days. No, I do not perceive it in this way. There is a huge gap between Poland and Russia when it comes to political life. The division of power and free media, for example. In Russia, when it comes to free media, we can mention only a couple of magazines, low circulation newspapers that are read by the representatives of the Russian intelligentsia. There is a newspaper called Novaya Gazeta, but only 1% of Russians read it. Most of people get information from television. Of course, people in big cities have internet, social networks, but Putin's electorate get information from television. We have free media in Poland. Of course, public television is pro-government and can be dangerous. There are people who get information from one source, but in turn, the majority of weekly newspapers represent views similar to the views of opposition. When it comes to magazines, pro-government weeklies are in the minority here. Of course they exist, but the vast majority are liberal. It can't even be compared with the situation in Russia. However, the problem is that besides journalists, people who are involved in political life, people who get information from different sources, listen to different views. The majority of society get information from one source. The person who watches public television, which is pro-government, doesn't watch TVN, which is opposition, and vice versa. Those who watch TVN do not watch public television. And in this case, society becomes more and more divided. People have different visions. Visions of Europe, visions of Poland, vision of the world. And such a division is very dangerous. However, in no way can it be compared with the situation in Russia. So, if Russia is not the role model for contemporary Poland, how is Russia perceived? How do the Poles see Russia? How Russia is perceived in Poland? I think that, first of all, as a threat. The Poles, when they hear Russia, feel some anxiety, some uncertainty. As I have mentioned before, it is a volcano that is rather close to our borders. There is a Kaliningrad region north of Poland. The concentration of weapons there is high, and this is a threat. It is not known when this volcano will explode. We have the case of Skripal in Britain. Director of the Institute of International Affairs, who was going to Moscow to attend a meeting devoted to the former Prime Minister Primakov. Primakovskie Katenia was banned from entering Russia for 3 years. He is the head of an important Polish research center. This is not a friendly gesture towards Poland. Of course, if such cases repeat, the reaction of Poles will be negative. At the same time, speaking about the young generation, for them, Russia is very distant and exotic. They are people who do not speak Russian. They do not know the Russian alphabet. They are very pro-Western. For this generation of 20-year-old people, Russia is a large and powerful state, but a state which is rather far. I had 20-year-old students who specialized in Russia. Even for them, Russia is something dangerous, but less and less understandable. You use the word volcano in connection with Russia, a volcano that might explode. You also mention danger and threat. In what sense does Russia seem like a threat? Is it in the military sense or the loss of independence? What exactly did you mean? This is the most dangerous threat because it is uncertain. Russia is unpredictable, and I think that Russia is deliberately trying to keep this image of an unpredictable country. That's why it turns to propaganda, underlining that it is unpredictable and everyone should be ready for anything. Of course, if you ask an average Pole if he imagines that Russia could attack Poland, I think that the majority will say that they do not expect such an act of aggression. We are a NATO member state. There is Article 5. There are some guarantees. The presence of American troops in our territory is of interest to Poland. In contrast, hacking attacks, for example, hostile intelligence type activities, put some light on this threat. On the other hand, It's a very uncertain threat, very unclear. It is like a volcano if we keep such a comparison, which can erupt and maybe cause a fire. It may also produce a cloud of smoke over some territory. This is a threat risk from which we can't be completely measured. You mentioned that the way Russia can be defined in the wider context is rather close to an authoritarian regime these days. You described it as a process, and if it is a process, it will probably continue and things will probably change. Do you believe in something as a free, liberal Russia? In the near future? I don't believe in it, because this is rooted in the masses. It's always the masses who give a quasi-invitation to the leader, and the leader starts to realize what he can do, or what he can build, what he is capable of. And more time is needed for the masses to change, because the educational system is what can change the things. There are two things that define a person's education. The most important is the family, which is untouchable by the ruling power, because they close the doors and talk about whatever they want at the dinner table. The second most important thing is the school, and the machinery of the state can tamper with the school. So, this is one option, but it is always decided by the powers what it will be like, and in what direction to steer education. And if there is a power concentration, there is no diversity. There is no multiplicity in the educational system, so it's more of a one-man rule. We can see that in countries where there's sharing of power, we call legal states, there is diversity in school systems, and they don't elect dictators in these countries. So maybe it's a question of centuries for this to be naturally adopted by Russia and other countries, the Arab states and Turkey. There's another chance. It's a faint chance, an 18th century model called enlightened absolutist monarchy. I find this interesting, but this is just a chance, because the masses in these countries want a charismatic leader by all means. They elect such people because they feel this will take the responsibility off their shoulders. So, if this charismatic leader gives rise to a medieval situation, then you have what we live in today. But if the 10% chance comes true that it will be an enlightened absolutist ruler like Frederick the Great or Joseph II of Austria, then these processes can speed up. But this is just a thought experiment. I don't really see a chance for this now. I'm going to ask the last question. We are sitting at Kiev's Independence Square, a place where people expressed their desire to live in freedom. In Russia, these events were called a fascist overturn. If there is a hope that Russia could become a free country, although in the short run these hopes may seem small, what advice would you give to countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the Caucasian countries? What should they do to live in freedom? What can they do? I think education is very important. It is important for the young generation to grow up under completely different standards. Yesterday, I spoke to one Polish correspondent who works here in Ukraine, who conducts training for Ukrainian journalists, and he said that the division of the Ukrainian society into patriots and traitors happen because of not keeping journalistic standards. That's what he is concerned about. And there is an argument that these standards aren't kept because of the war, that the situation is unique. You want us to keep journalistic standards, but at the same time, there is a war in Donbass. So you belong to the traitors' camp. So this is a complete misunderstanding of the matter. I believe, on the contrary, that journalistic standards are particularly important in such a situation. Therefore, such trainings which are provided by the Polish correspondents, his colleagues, and a number of other people are important. I think that this knowledge transferred to various people, to young people, journalists, I think that it can contribute to critical changes. It is impossible to imagine Ukraine is not independent. First, because the generation that does not remember the Soviet Union is growing up. Secondly, this generation is different from the previous ones. I deeply, deeply believe in it. I believe in education, in knowledge. Does Ukraine have hope? Well, just like other countries, Ukraine can also have hopes. I don't know what the situation is like here at the moment. I don't know to what extent it functions as an imperial regime. As I look at the buildings around us, institutions operating in such buildings are not in service of the people, but they are the ones that use the people. I know that these are buildings from the 50s, but I think that the feudal system is very deep-rooted here as well. However, if now there is pluralism here, a real multi-party system as opposed to Russia or Hungary, then Ukraine's hope lies in creating an educational system that is diverse and colourful enough and teaches advocacy of interests. It doesn't teach subjects in order to transfer a mass of knowledge, but it teaches you to see correlations and recognize processes. Otherwise, I think, as regards independence, that pertaining to each of these countries, Ukraine, Russia, Poland and Hungary, I think that the destruction of the biosphere is a more immediate and alarming threat than the prospect of losing our independence. Today, we've had several guests here, and we've discussed whether it would be possible to live freely in the neighborhood of Russia. There have been many interesting points, but first, let me ask Volodymyr, who also gave the summary in the previous episodes. What was the most interesting idea you've heard from our guests today? I think that we heard a lot of interesting analyses, which I completely agree with. We see that Russia's actions have different logic compared to the Western countries. I would say that this is the logic that Western countries had 100 years ago. This is the logic of expansion. This is a logic of something called zoopolitics. meaning treating the politics as some biological war. And, of course, it's very difficult for the neighbors, such as Ukraine. For me, it's very important to listen to people from Central Europe, Hungarians, Czechs, and Slovaks, because we see there are not so many differences now between us, Ukrainians and Czechs. We see the same challenges. This is the viral spread of the Russian narrative or Russian way of life. We see this is what happens in Hungary, in Poland. I think it's quite dangerous. And when, 4 years ago, we were talking about a radical split between Ukraine and Russia, we see the tendency for return, not of pro-Russian messages, but at least of patriarchal ideas or ideas that undermine this European model. And this is a very dangerous, and I'm afraid of this personally. There was an interesting thing that was mentioned. It was the idea that we, the West, would have to show courage. It is interesting as it sort of suggests that we are not brave enough now when it comes to Russia. Do you, Ukrainians, see us, the West, as cowards? Are we not brave enough? Such a thought exists, and it's widespread in many circles, but it seems to me we need to understand that Europe and the Western world live according to the values of freedom, the values of self-expression, where the issue of security is settled and you don't actually think about security. So, to think that something is threatening you is quite an unusual thought for you. You become brave when you feel threatened. When you are not threatened, there is no reason for you to be brave. We have started to see some preconditions for that recently. In the UK, in the Czech Republic, in Germany, there is now the feeling that Russia is a security threat. And I really hope the response will become braver and braver. But, on the other hand, we see a very dangerous tendency, and I hear the same phrase mentioned from the Western Europeans, which is of a great concern to me. They say, Trump, Putin. Putin, Trump. Putting the US and Russia on the same level. Some people even think Trump is even more dangerous than Putin. And then we have the temptation that Europe can become a bridge between the US and Europe. And then we ruin that transatlantic unity. And of course, Europe will start to maneuver. And this can be dangerous. We see that during Macron's visit to Russia, etc. So as for this idea of bravery and courage, people will perceive it as something not smart, and I think it's quite dangerous. And this is something we need to fight. Yes, we understand that Trump can be very crazy, but this should not call the unity of the Western civilization into question. When we come to Kiev, as we have done several times, we can see how people live here, what wages and pensions they get, and it's quite difficult to live here in terms of healthcare or education. But despite this, the Ukrainian nation is stronger and more unified than ever before, and it is able to stand up against the Russian forces very proudly. If we turn to the West, we can hear some voices that sanctions should be lifted, or things like, who knows what the story is like, maybe Russia has certain rights to act like that, and so on. I feel sort of ashamed when I compare Ukraine's ability to revolt and our defeated approach in the West.
ustupovanie zlu.
Do you still want to be a part of the EU as it is now? The European Union is not a military organization. We know that. When I'm asked in Paris or Berlin why Ukraine has so many hopes for the US and Washington, my answer is very simple. Because we cannot expect security from the EU. In fact, I'm not sure we can expect safety and security from the US. Meaning, Ukraine now ensures security on its own. But at least we understand that Brussels and Paris and Berlin cannot guarantee us security. On the other hand, if we talk about sanctions, I would say that it is mostly a disappointing issue. And there are reasons for this disappointing. Yes, the sanctions existed. It is very good that they have been in force for 4 years, and every year they say that maybe they will lift them off. But they don't. But the main sector of the Russian economy, the energy sector, that gives all the money, 80% of the budget, is not covered by sanctions. Gazprom is a sponsor of the Champions League. Nord Stream 2 is being constructed. And if you look at the figures, it will be a huge blow for the Ukrainian economy. Yeah, there are some small sanctions. Russia suffered badly a few years ago. But now, when the oil prices are growing, the Russian economy is growing. And the question is whether the sanctions slowed down the Russian economy or were that the oil prices. So, in this way, we can say that this movement should have been bigger. But if you think pragmatically, I don't really believe the EU will increase the sanctions, and I think that the US is more active here. And the last question that I asked all the guests: how is it possible for countries neighboring Russia to live freely? Ukraine not only borders with Russia, but it was also attacked by Russia, and a part of the country was stolen. So how can Ukraine live freely in the future nearby Russia? Well, it is difficult. Meaning, now we can't talk about some kind of reconciliation. It's just impossible to talk about reconciliation right now. First, we need to finish the war, and secondly, I think that a lot of time will pass until it happens. Whether Russia can be liberal and free is a big question which we have heard here today. I'm quite skeptical about that. Take a look at the Russian history. Every 100 years, some liberal explosion happens. We see the beginning of the 19th century. It is the victory of Alexander I over Napoleon. Around the same time, it was an idea to give the constitution to Russia. And then, in a few decades, there were the Decembrists, a big revolt which was suppressed. After that, there was the authoritarian regime. Then we have the beginning of the 20th century, when the liberal revolution, the February Revolution, took place. Russia was in chaos, and then the Bolsheviks came, and a totalitarian regime is established. The same happened in the 1990s, so the Russians associate the liberal regime with chaos. And it's a big danger for Ukraine as well, because in this region, when you give the freedom, but people consider this freedom as anarchy, they don't understand that there is some responsibility, and the main thing is that there should be some balanced freedom, the rule of law, etc. But when this freedom appears, people associate it with chaos, and then they go back to the totalitarian regime. Ukrainians are slightly different here, because not trusting government and hierarchy is a part of the spirit of the Ukrainian nation. We can even say we have some love for anarchy, ideal anarchy, in a sense of some Cossack anarchy and freedom. And in this sense, of course, we will always strive for more freedom from Russians. But the problem in Ukraine is that now we have the big dilemma about what we should put first, freedom or security. And we have this discussion with the West on both issues, because security is very important, but freedom is also very important. But sometimes you have to choose whether you give the freedom to so-called propaganda bodies that mask themselves as the media. Shall we give them freedom? Or is this an issue of security and military logic, when you have to limit the access to enemy's propaganda in your territory? And Ukraine is constantly looking for this balance between freedom and security. It is very difficult. Is it possible for Ukraine to defend its freedom having Russia as a neighbor?
S Ruskom na svojich hraniciach?
I think yes, as it used to be. We've lived with Russians for a long time. And basically, our history is constantly the history of either assimilation or cooperation or confrontation. And really, the paradox is that despite all these attempts of destroying Ukrainian nation that we see, destroying of Cossacks' autonomy in 17th and 18th century, ban of the Ukrainian language in the 19th century, the famine, the artificial famine in the 20th century, we see that the Ukrainian nation becomes even stronger after sinking into oblivion. So Kiev is now much more Ukrainian-speaking city than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. Now the Ukrainian culture is much more powerful than it was in the 19th or 20th century. So yes, we live next to quite an aggressive nation and aggressive regime, but it does not stop us from development. Thank you very much.